The morning, Dan and Amy. So, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signing a bill to, in his words, stop the censorship of Floridians by big tech. The legislation will allow Floridians treated unfairly by big tech platforms to sue companies that violate this law when monetary damages. I think $100,000 was the cap that I saw.
Yep.
The AG of the state of Florida can bring action against tech companies that violate this law. If social media platforms are found to have violated antitrust law, they'll be restricted from contracting with any public entity in the state of Florida. It's also prohibited from deplatforming Floridian political candidates. The Florida Election Commission will impose fines of up to $250,000 per day on any social media company that deplatforms any candidate for statewide office, and $25,000 per day for deplatforming candidates for non-statewide offices. Interesting, in terms of the some of the law that implicates. We'll get to that in a second. DeSantis fielding a question from a Miami Herald reporter that it was so perfectly set up for him, it's almost like he planted it.
Governor, hi. I want to ask you about the bill that you're signing here today. You're a loyal supporter of former President Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump is now a resident in Florida, and he was deplatformed. Is this bill for him?
The bill is for everyday Floridians, this is what we said, and it will allow any Floridian to be able to provide what they're doing. So, but I do think that's another issue that has been brought to bear. When you deplatform the President of the United States, but you let Ayatollah Khomeini talk about killing Jews, that
Yeah, wish we had that here.
Yeah.
Wish we had that here. That would never happen.
For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Bradley Smith, chairman of the Institute for Free Speech and the Blackmore Nault Professor of Law at Capital University. He served on the Federal Election Commission from 2000 to 2005. Bradley, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
What do you think about that law in Florida? Yes, DeSantis is right. Deplatforming the President of the United States, but providing a platform for mullahs in Iran to advocate killing Jews, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But should it be illegal, or is that an area for government regulation?
Well, this is a tough issue that divides people all across the political spectrum. And thinking folks coming from the right, on the one hand, there's the traditional view that, look, these platforms, they're private enterprises, and they get to choose who or what appears on their platform. On the other hand, there's a view that they should be viewed more as, we might say, common carriers like bus companies or the phone company or something like that. In other words, that they need to serve all comers. And you can't really have a thriving democracy when the primary means of communication are limited based on the choices of a handful of billionaires in Silicon Valley. And I think that's also a very troubling thing for people. There's also a bigger issue here, which is, to the extent that you have, you're not going to keep a First Amendment that prevents the government from getting involved and limiting our speech if we don't value it in the private sector. If you have generations of students now being brought up with the idea that free speech should be limited, that if you don't like Donald Trump's views, your solution is not to argue with those views or vote against them or to organize, but to just simply try to silence those views. And so I think that's very troubling for people. So it will be interesting to see what goes on with the Florida statute and what kind of effects it has. And I expect that it will also be subject to a constitutional or legal challenge based on both First Amendment grounds and on the idea of federal preemption that the federal government has already regulated this area.
Yeah, I think so too. And as much as I appreciate DeSantis's perspective, I'm very uncomfortable with this. And you were describing, I think, the dynamic accurately. But I think even conservatives have sort of forgotten to process this a little bit. Free speech includes the right to argue for tyranny. The question is whether we decide to give ourselves over to tyranny. But you can argue for all sorts of terrible ideas. That's the point of free speech. It's not to protect things that are, it's not to protect discussions about sunshine and puppies. It's about to protect things that are unpopular, or whether it's from one perspective conservatism, for another perspective tyranny.
Well, that's right. And, one thing we've seen lately, too, is that the arguments often made is not only sometimes that these views are reprehensible or whatever, which, again, as you point out, on the other hand, the Ayatollah Khomeini's views aren't necessarily very reprehensible, it seems. But there's also this question of disinformation now. People say, well, it's disinformation. And we need to remember that today's disinformation at least sometimes becomes tomorrow's truth. So, for example, 15 months ago, Senator Tom Cotton was blasted all across the major press for suggesting that the COVID virus may have escaped from the lab in Wuhan. And nowadays that is starting to become suddenly the norm. There's lots of questions being asked and whether the Chinese government's denials were truthful and so on. So, something that was deemed misinformation not that long ago is now coming around to perhaps being perceived as more likely to be the truth. And we've seen it in other areas of COVID as well, just even things like, don't wear a mask, then do wear a mask and so on. And this idea, rather than letting people question CDC advice and offer evidence as to whether it's right or wrong, we just say whatever the CDC seems to be saying at the moment, nobody else can say anything else. And then the CDC changes its advice. So, that's one of the advantages of free speech is it allows us to progress, to find errors and to improve and to change things, to come up with new ideas. And we're going to suffocate that if we're not careful.
Well, has anybody asked those eggheads in Silicon Valley, hey, why are you silencing Trump on social media but letting dictators have a voice?
Well, I think the actual answer comes. I think we know the answer, right? Which is they really don't like Donald Trump.
Right.
It's not just some people at the top. It's not just some of the people at the top, but also their workforces. You have to think about somebody like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, who has probably done more than a lot of the other tech titans to try to keep Facebook relatively open and avoid some of these seemingly arbitrary decisions. But imagine that he's got enormous pressure from his own workforce, which is overwhelmingly in favor of this type of censorship, it appears. And that makes it very hard to run a company. And so this is a problem that goes deep in our society and what our young people have been taught. And this idea that many of them have that they're not even physically safe if words they don't like are being heard from candidates or other people that they don't like.
I want to talk a little bit about election integrity with the debates raging at the state level as well as the federal level, as you well know. And your impressions based on what we know at this juncture, maybe including whatever you've heard that isn't readily publicly available on the Maricopa County audit.
Well, I don't know much about the details of what's going on in the Maricopa County audit. It seems to me that, from what I've seen for years, there were problems in the election. I think the big problem is that most of those problems weren't things that involved illegal votes. They were changing the rules at the last minute. So what was done was, in a sense, legal. One of the best examples is in Pennsylvania, where the state Supreme Court, an elected Supreme Court controlled by Democrats, simply changed the state's law with very little reason for it other than this will benefit Democrats. But that doesn't make it illegal or fraudulent in the sense that people seem to want to think. The votes cast were not fraudulent. And I just don't think there's much evidence that anyone has found yet to suggest that there was anywhere near the kind of fraud that would have cost the president the election. And I think probably Republicans are going to be better equipped to focus on moving forward, getting more votes, and blocking in the U.S. House this bill. Well, it's passed in the House H.R. 1, blocking in the Senate S.1, its companion bill. It's called the For the People Act, and it's a sweeping federal government takeover of election systems in all the states with a huge wish list for things that I think most Americans would think were kind of odd, like mandating that convicted felons, be allowed to vote, mandating the voter registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, lots of speech-limiting provisions in that bill. Back to our subject of limiting speech, it would make it harder for people to criticize candidates, to speak out. It would give billions of dollars in federal government money to political campaigns. Others give it straight to candidates. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Nancy Pelosi or whomever would get federal government money on which to campaign. So lots of bad stuff, and I think conservatives would probably do better to focus their attention on moving forward and making sure that these kinds of things are headed off.
And there's something too about technology, and this isn't conspiratorial. It's just you think you have the latest and greatest technology, so that your system is fail-safe. And the story out of New Hampshire is interesting, where Republicans in a small community in New Hampshire, Windham, won all 4 seats in a legislative election, but a Democrat candidate requested a recount because she had apparently lost by 24 votes. They did a hand recount. She actually lost by 99 votes rather than 24 votes. And one of the things they found was that a fold through a vote, when it's being processed through like a vote target, can create a vote even if there wasn't a vote there. And so there were ballots that were marked for this woman who asked for the recount that the machines misinterpreted upon hand and individual reinspection. And I say that because there's a story out of Maricopa County, too, about batch adjudication of ballots that may have resulted in defaulting to a particular ballot position that attributed votes to Biden that should have otherwise gone to Trump. That's a story out there. I don't know if it's true, don't know the extent of it, don't know that it would have changed the outcome in Arizona. But I'm just talking about not conspiratorial, not Democrat activists, but just the idea that technology is fail-safe. And we have a story out of Maricopa County and an actual event that seems to be confirmed on the ground in New Hampshire.
Well, one thing that I think we should do, I think one of the big problems right now in America is this crisis of belief that we can simply even trust the electoral results. And I pointed out that actually this has generally been, until this past year, an issue with Democrats more than Republicans. And I think it's very important that we make sure that the systems are transparent, that we should not be objecting, for example, to the idea of someone having a recount or challenging the results of the election. After 2020, it seemed like it was beyond the pale for Trump to challenge the results of the election. Now, that's part of the process, is to have an election challenge, to have recounts. And usually recounts, as you mentioned, don't change very much. Or again, this woman in New Hampshire, she lost by a few more votes after the recount. But I think that using paper ballots and making sure that the system is open and not being afraid of recounts is probably a healthy thing for restoring Americans' confidence in the election results.
Thinking about, again, this may be something that would be under FEC purview and potentially state election commission purview as well. This treatment of big tech, I mean, sort of building on what DeSantis is doing in Florida, and the idea that if you're going to wire your system for a particular candidate, algorithmically, for example, with respect to search results, for example, then that represents an in-kind contribution to that candidate, and then search engines like a Google could fall under FEC purview. Now, that opens up some other potential problems too, where every story in every news outlet becomes an in-kind contribution, or arguably does, and that may not be something we want to do. But that's certainly been something that's sort of been bandied about right now as a way to again try to discipline big tech.
Yeah, as you point out, if you start saying that everything someone does that might in some way help a candidate becomes an in-kind contribution, you've just created a true Leviathan. Because think about, almost everything. I mean, we're talking on this radio program, right? And it might influence people in some way.
Right.
We talk about things, when we have. I think it's a very dangerous road to go down. I think we're better off to take the approach that we've long advocated, the Institute for Free Speech, which is to continue to deregulate this system, get the government out of it so the government can't put its thumb on the scale at all through the enforcement process or anything else. Let people speak their minds and let the voters decide what they want to do. I think that's the better way to go. I don't think that rules out what is sort of a related but somewhat different issue, which is whether or not these large tech platforms should be treated as a common carrier, which are required to carry, any customer who wants to use them. Again, as we talked about earlier, I think that's a difficult viewpoint. But I think, you could have that latter solution saying you have to carry these people and not have it become that anytime you do, or if you change your algorithm a little bit, that is an in-kind contribution. That I think is something that would be a very dangerous road. I mean, you just think of the enormous power you'd be giving to the federal government to enforce that, and to enforce it in a discriminatory way. That would be problematic for us all.
Bradley Smith, chairman of the Institute for Free Speech and the Blackmore Naught Professor of Law at Capital University. He also served on the Federal Election Commission from 2000 to 2005. Bradley Smith, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. All right.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Is it time to have your sump pump checked? Hi, this is John with Basement Flood Protector. I'm a veteran and the owner. Since 1970.